Hello everyone, I'm John and we are reading Cultural Anthropology, asking questions about humanity. Jumping right back in. Can anybody own culture? As we have defined culture, the question of owning culture may appear to make little sense. How can somebody own, let me turn the light on. How can somebody own the collective processes that make the artificial seem natural? For the most part, owning culture is about power relations between people, who controls resources, and typically minority communities who have been kept outside the mainstream. At one level, nobody can own culture, but many will claim the exclusive right to the symbols that gave it power and meaning. The debate over sports teams, Indian mascots, is only one example of a conflict over who has the right to use, control, and even own symbols, objects, and cultural processes. This conflict is related to the phenomenon of cultural appropriation, the unilateral decision of one social group to take control over the symbols, practices, or objects of another. Cultural appropriation is as old as humanity itself. The fact that people adopt ideas, practices, and technologies from other societies demonstrates the fluidity of social boundaries and partially explains why societies and cultures are changing all the time. Yet cultural appropriation also often involves relationships of domination and subordination between social groups. For American Indians, for example, the pressure to assimilate into dominant white Euro-American society has coincided with the dominant society's appropriation of Indian cultural symbols. That appropriation goes beyond the use of Indian images as sports mascots and includes, among others, kids playing Indian, New Age religion's imitation of Indian spirituality and rituals, Hollywood's endless fascination with making movies about Indians, even the use of the Zaya Pueblo sun symbol on the New Mexico state flag. While some Indians do not mind, others find the usage of Indian symbols degrading and simplistic because they ignore the realities of Indian communities and traditions, or because nobody asked permission to use the culturally meaningful object and symbol. Some of these conflicts have taken shape as dramatic protests, as in the 2002 case of Australian Aboriginal activists who removed the coat of arms at the old Parliament House in Canberra. They declared that images of the kangaroo and emu, a large flightless Australian bird resembling an ostrich, on the national seal are the cultural property of Aboriginal people. Other conflicts have happened in courts, such as the highly publicized lawsuit Zaya Pueblo brought against the state of New Mexico in 1994. Formerly demanding reparations for the use of the Zaya sun symbol in the state flag. Anthropologists have not escaped indigenous scrutiny and criticism for claiming expertise about native cultures. Anthropologist Kay Warren, for example, studied the rise of the Pan-Maya ethnic movement in Guatemala when she gave an academic presentation on Maya political activism. Maya intellectuals and political leaders in attendance responded by challenging the right of foreign anthropologists even to study Maya culture. As Warren points out, indigenous movements like Pan-Mayanism reject the idea that anthropological knowledge is neutral or objective. They insist that doing anthropology raises important political and ethical questions. Who should benefit from anthropological research? Why do the people studied by anthropologists not get an opportunity to help define and evaluate research projects? And I'm doing some laundry in the background, so just gotta bear with me. Responding to such questions, a number of anthropologists like Warren have modified how they do cultural research, including inviting the subjects of their research to be collaborators in all stages of the research, from the definition of the study all the way through to publication. An anthropologist as problem solver, Michael Ames in Collaborative Museum exhibits, we explore how one anthropologist collaborated with indigenous peoples in the creation of museum exhibitions. Conclusion. At the heart of all anthropological discussions of culture is the idea that cultures help people understand and respond to a constantly changing world. As we have defined it, culture consists of the collective processes that make the artificial seem natural. Based on symbols and expressed through values, norms, and traditions, culture often offers a relatively stable and common base of information and knowledge, so that people can live together in groups. A holistic perspective on culture illustrates how different domains of a society interrelate. But culture is also dynamic, responding to innovation, creativity, and struggles over meaning. In spite of the many difficulties involved in studying culture, it is more important than ever to understand culture. What is it, and how cultural processes work? The big and urgent matters of our time have cultural causes and consequences. These matters range from the problems posed by development and change for indigenous groups and heated conflicts about social identity over mascots and traditions on college campuses, to others like terrorism, environmental degradation and sustainability, ethnic diversity and racial conflict, religious intolerance, globalization, and healthcare. As you read this book, you will learn how anthropologists use cultural perspectives to understand, explain, and even contribute to resolving problems related to these matters. Readings. For an overview of different theories of culture in anthropology and how and why they differ across schools of thought within the discipline, see Adam Cooper's Culture, the Anthropologist's Account. In this book, Cooper actually expresses deep skepticism about the centrality of the culture concept to anthropology and illustrates why anthropologists continue to debate what culture means. For an intellectual history of the development of the culture concept in anthropology and its place in the discipline during the early 20th century, the essays in George Stocking's book, Race, Culture, and Evolution, Essays in the History of Anthropology, are classics and remain relevant today. The book, Who Owns Culture, by an anthropologist, Michael Brown, is a highly readable account of the vexing legal, ethical, and methodological issues involved in who owns native cultural symbols and heritage. Chapter 3, Beyond Nature and Nurture, the Individual Biology and Culture. In 2001, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission filed a court action against the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, alleging that the company had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. The commission claimed that the company had secretly run genetic tests on the blood of 36 employees who suffered from carpal tunnel syndrome, a painful wrist condition usually brought on by repetitive motion. The blood was drawn during a comprehensive medical exam required of any worker claiming disability from carpal tunnel syndrome. The company's apparent goal was to identify workers who might be genetically predisposed to the development of carpal tunnel syndrome, so they could deny those people's works compensation benefits for the injuries. The company settled the case, paid a fine, and stopped the testing, denying any wrongdoing. Medical experts questioned the legitimacy of the test being used and pointed out that the disease is associated much more closely with conditions in the workplace environment than with genetics. It caused many commentators to worry openly about a future in which employers and insurance companies will provide coverage for only the genetically fit. It also raised questions about how individuals might guard the privacy of data about their genetic constitution. This case underscores a kind of blind faith that the general public has developed in relation to the genetic screening itself. We often believe that our biological hardwiring, the innate components of our makeup, such as genes, hormones, neurons, and the like, defines human nature. That is, the fundamental dispositions of who people are as individuals, the maladies they suffer, and even their intelligence. News outlets confirm these beliefs nearly every day with proclamations that scientists have discovered a new gene or hormone that explains disease, mental illness, gender characteristics, sexual preference, racial type, personality, or emotional status. The high profile of genetic studies naturally leads people to believe that biology is destiny, but the reality is more complex than that. In the area of the Human Genome Project, the multi-billion-dollar scientific research venture began in 1990 to identify map the human genetic makeup, or nature. Biology appears to be winning out over nurture, environmental and cultural influences as the key to understanding ourselves. But an anthropologist, as well as many biologists and other scientists, are deeply skeptical of grandiose claims about biological destiny. These scholars recognize that this sort of "it's all in your genes and hormones" thinking is a cultural idiom our society uses to understand human nature, just as other societies use other idioms and metaphors to understand their own individual and collective selves. This is not to deny that biology plays a role in who we are as individuals, but our biology works together with our culture to make us who we are and to determine what we can accomplish and which diseases we will experience. Nature and nurture, a common shorthand term that refers to biological and cultural or environmental influences, are not opposed and mutually exclusive, but rather intertwined and emergent processes. That is, our genes work together with our culture and environment to shape our lives as individuals. A full appreciation of the human condition requires that we avoid thinking of ourselves as either cultural or biological or natural beings, but through a new and emerging paradigm that emphasizes humans as biocultural beings in which biological, psychological, and cultural processes interact in complex ways. At the heart of the debate over whether biology or culture controls our behavior as individuals is the question around which this chapter is organized. How should we make sense of the biological and cultural factors that together shape human nature? Embedded in this broader question are the following problems, around which the chapter is organized. The claim that humans are biologically hardwired ignores biocultural variations in how we experience our bodies as individuals. We can appreciate this point by exploring two major issues covered in this chapter: the dynamics of human cognition and psychology, and the role of evolution in human lives. All right, we're back. Together, these themes demonstrate the complex ways that culture interacts with human biological processes to create many possible human natures, not just one human nature. What can the biology of brain development teach us about culture? The idea of human nature as something fixed in our biology has been central to Western European and American ideas about humanity for more than a century. This view, which is still deeply entrenched in American culture, holds that the psychological makeup of our brain governs, if not fully determines, how we will respond to various psychological and emotional stimuli and the lengths we will go to satisfy them. From this perspective, it is just our nature, or who we are. The norms of our society and culture may temper these reactions to some extent, but it seems hard to fight human nature. Most people would assume that this biological hardwiring is in our brains and is what directs our thoughts and responses to the world. But over the past several decades, a revolution in the cognitive sciences, the study of the process of thought, or cognition, has taught us many lessons about human brain development, thinking, and evolution. One of the most powerful findings is that culture plays a key role in growth and development of neurons in the brain that allows for cognition. Neurons are the brain cells that transmit information through chemical and electrical signals. Cultural influence on neuron growth has striking implications for understanding the human mind. The human brain does not exist in some idealized natural state. It is continually influenced by cognition and bioculturally variable phenomenon that depend on the culture in which we grow up and live. Our mind is therefore the logical place to begin to mend the perceived gap between culture and biology. The adaptable human brain. Understanding the adaptability of the human brain can begin by comparing it to the brains of non-human primates. Most non-human primates are born with their brains largely developed. At birth, the brain of a macaque, is a type of monkey, for example, is 60% of its adult size. That of a chimpanzee, our nearest primate relative, at birth is 45%. After birth, the rate of neural development in both species slows considerably. But when humans are born, our brains are only 25% of their eventual weight, meaning that a full 75% of human brain development occurs after birth. During the first 2 years of life, human brain construction does not slow down, as among other primates, but continues at the same rate it did in the womb. As our natural pathways develop, they allow for more complex thoughts and are tied to the development of cultural behavior. Our brains do not mature until puberty, although they are still developing significantly into our early 20s and beyond into old age, giving humans a degree of mental flexibility and dexterity unparalleled anywhere else in the animal kingdom. The most crucial processes of human brain construction take place during the first 5 years after birth, a period that coincides with the most intensive processes of enculturation in an individual's life. Our brains develop and grow in the context of a particular culture and within a set of social relationships. As we learn language, how to behave in certain settings, how to hunt or plant crops, or how to read or play computer games, humans are encultured to think and act in a conventional way of their society. Our brains build neural pathways that reflect these lessons. It therefore makes sense to refer to the human brain as a cultured brain. Far from being fixed at birth by genetic and neural factors, our brains are functionally pliable and adaptable organs that operate as generalized learning and problem-solving devices. The evolution of our species appears to have favored brains that are flexible, responsive to a much wider range of environments and novel situations than any other primate. Even before the emergence of anatomically modern humans, or Homo sapiens, our ancestors demonstrated behavioral versatility and problem-solving abilities, and were able to adapt to a wide variety of specific and changing natural environments. We know this because Homo erectus, an ancestral species of Homo sapiens, was able to expand its range from eastern and southern Africa to most of Europe and Asia nearly 2 million years ago. Evidence of what cognitive scientists call neuroplasticity, or the moldability and flexibility of brain structure, is illustrated by the fact that people born without hands can develop the ability to feed themselves or use simple tools with their feet, and that blind people can develop acute hearing and heightened tactile senses. Our brains also help us acquire skills that are culturally defined and not part of our species' evolutionary heritage, such as reading, writing, and playing computer games. Neuroplasticity is also evident in the role that culture plays in shaping some basic aspects of perception. For example, people growing up in societies with little two-dimensional art must learn how to understand photographs after first seeing them. Cultural differences in perception suggest that mental development varies with cultural practices. The mind and culture. The human mind is the emergent qualities of consciousness and intellect that manifest themselves through thought, emotion, perception, will, and imagination. More than just an information processor, the mind also constructs cognitive models and identifiable sets of patterns to make sense of the world around us. Such models are a kind of operator's manual for the mind, providing a pattern for one's own behavior, for interpreting other people's actions. These models help us make meaning out of raw information by filling in the gaps in our direct knowledge. Anthropologists have long recognized the importance of these cognitive models, referring to them as cultural models because they are external or public and shared by a social group. Anthropologists also recognize personal models, or an individual's idiosyncratic ways of making sense of things. To understand the difference between cultural and personal cognitive models, imagine, for example, that you are at a baseball game. You stand and take off your hat to sing the national anthem. If you're watching the game at home, you do neither. These are cultural models, public and conventional in the sense that we all know how to act in these different situations. When invested with great social importance, cultural models can become social institutions, forms of greetings, calendars, games, chants, conventional body postures, rituals, to name just a few, are examples of social institutions that began as cultural models. A personal model is quite different. Consider, for example, how you personally think about your city, which probably has little to do with your city's actual layout. While some of you might think of it in terms of business districts and residential neighborhoods, others might think of it in terms of important landmarks, and still others might think of places where they had significant experiences. More likely, your personal model of the city is a combination of these mental representations and is unique to you. Uniting mind and matter, a biocultural perspective. Increasing biocultural evidence also suggests that cognition does not happen separately from our bodies. The human nervous system is a complex neurological network that reads and regulates chemical and biological conditions throughout the entire body, not just our thinking brains. Human biology sets certain broad outer limits that all humans share, but the actual character of cognitive processes differ from one individual to the next and across cultures because of the influence of external factors. These external factors include social context and culture, with which the nervous system interacts through individual cognition. For example, the mental stresses people experience because of rapid social and political economic change, or contradictions between cultural and personal models have well-documented physical and bodily consequences, including raising blood pressure, affecting immunity to disease, and creating symptoms of fatigue or feeling of inadequacy. These mental stresses may accompany other biological impacts, including changes in nutrition and general health. The mind manifests itself through the whole person throughout an individual's lifetime. Taking its biocultural approach to the mind and cognition seriously requires us to rethink our basic assumptions about what an individual person is and how we might understand the psychology of people in other cultures. How do anthropologists understand other people's psychologies? The biocultural perspective has only recently begun to take root in the field of cultural anthropology, but it also builds on a rich history of research regarding how cultural and social contexts shape the psychologies, emotions, and personalities of individuals. In this section, we consider a variety of theories suggested by anthropologists to explain culturally distinct notions of individual psychology. To begin, it's helpful to consider how anthropologists have thought about the individual person. What is an individual person? This question might seem strange, partially because the answer seems so simple and straightforward. We tend to think individual persons are like onions. Peel back the layers from the surface, and underneath, humans are all organisms of a certain anatomy, physiology, and cognition. Moving outward from that essential biological core, we see other layers with social and cultural influences usually nearest to the surface. But anthropologists have long resisted such a simple perspective because it downplays how central culture is to shaping what a person is. For much of the discipline's history, cultural anthropologists have been keenly interested in the individual person, even though the discipline's primary interest lies in the collective and social aspects of human life. Important work on the individual has taken place in the subfield of psychological anthropology, which studies the psychological states and conditions of individuals. It closely parallels and often intersects with cognitive anthropology. It seeks to reconcile psychology's focus on the individual with anthropology's focus on culture and society. The Culture and Personality School. Psychological anthropology grew out of mid-20th century culture and personality studies by anthropologists. The Culture and Personality School focused on how patterns of child rearing, social institutions, and cultural ideologies shaped individual experience, personality characteristics, and thought patterns. The assumption was that how children are bathed, fed, and attended to white infants and toddlers shape their approach to the world. Most culture and personality studies tried to show that our individual or collective psychologies were primarily shaped by environment, nurture, rather than by our biology, nature. An important culture and personality scholar was Ruth Benedict, a student of Franz Boas and a teacher and close friend of Margaret Mead, an American anthropologist who gained popular fame in the 20th century for her writings on culture. Benedict's classic book, Patterns of Culture, is a major work in American anthropology and is popular in its own right, read by millions of undergraduates and selling nearly 2 million copies, and translated into 24 languages. Benedict argued that personal cultures produce more or less consistent patterns of thought and action in individuals. For example, she argued that the Zuni of the southwestern Pueblos are moderate in temperament and prefer not to stand out in a crowd, closely following their cultural norms. In contrast, she observed that the Kwakiutl culture of Native American culture of the Northwest Coast exhibits a patterned will to superiority that expresses itself in the aggressive and competitive personality characteristics of the individual Kwakiutl. The box Classic Contributions, Ruth Benedict, The Individual and Culture, elaborates on Benedict's contributions to thinking about the relationship between the individual and culture. Culture and personality studies represented an effort to reconcile the divide between the individual and culture, but they had several important weaknesses. For example, they assumed that a society has only one personality type, and that childhood enculturation determines adult personality. We now know that neither is true. They also minimized how much our Western cultural constructions about individual persons can shape and even get in the way of our understanding of other cultures that have different concepts of individual persons. The individual persons and selves. During the 20th century, European and American anthropologists who were not part of the culture and personality school were also interested in the individual. Rather than dwelling on personality types and subjective personal experience, they focused on the individual as a social category and what it revealed about how a society works. French sociologist Emile Durkheim and Michael Mauss focused on the person, the socially recognized individual, as a universal social category, that is, one found among all peoples, whose characteristics would vary depending on a society's customs and beliefs. For example, they observed that modern European and American societies value each unique individual and define a person as a bounded and sacred being with an inner self and consciousness. In contrast, they claim that so-called pre-modern societies primarily value social solidarity, emphasizing the fulfillment of family roles as a basic condition of personhood, while the former was understood as an egocentric view of personhood. The latter emphasized a sociocentric view of the person. In fact, anthropologists have observed great variation across cultures in terms of how they define full personhood. For example, in parts of Melanesia, individuals are not born as persons, but gain full personhood only after they begin exchanging objects with others. In many Zapotec Indian villages in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca, individuals do not gain full rights that any person enjoys, such as owning land, using resources, or even residing in a community until they marry, assume normal adult social roles, and fulfill communal duties in the local fiestas and governance. There's also a great variation in the specific attributes different cultures recognize in personhood. The Dinka of South Sudan, for example, think of the conscience and obligation to fulfill personal responsibilities not as a property that lies deep inside the individual psyche, as we do, but as an external spirit named Mathiang Gok that sizes an individual and forces him or her to own up to his or her personal responsibilities. Contemporary psychological anthropologists take the cultural variability of concepts of personhood for granted, but they have also added a new element, viewing persons as cultural basis for formulating and exploring subjective experience, a theme that did not directly interest the Durkheimians, Kirkpatrick and White, to differentiate the interest Sorry about that, everybody. Psychological anthropologists use the term self to refer to an individual's conception of his or her fundamental qualities and consciousness. Although not all anthropologists have seen the distinction between persons and selves as fully satisfactory, these revelations about cultural variation in concepts of persons and selfhood do raise questions about the universality of our own American notions of individual psychology. It has led to an anthropology of different psychologies around the world, which we sometimes refer to as ethnopsychology. Ethnopsychology. One of the key lessons of psychological anthropology has been that our own assumptions about what a person is, as well as our own psychological terms and concepts, might differ greatly from and could even get in the way of understanding indigenous psychological concepts. In researching these themes, the challenge is to translate foreign concepts so they are intelligible to us while preserving as much of their original meaning as we can. This problem is not simply one of linguistic translation, but of rendering whole modes of thought and feeling intelligible. This is the domain of ethnopsychology, or how others, societies, make sense of persons, selves, and emotions. The ethnopsychological approach, which accepts the validity of indigenous psychological categories and understanding, is also at the heart of so-called cultural psychology, an emerging field that straddles the disciplines of anthropology and psychology. Emotions, the effects and feelings we experience as humans, represent one of those areas in which the concepts we take for granted may not have an exact equivalent. Right, you know what I'm trying to say. In other culture, for example, anthropologist Michelle Rosaldo, who was the spouse of Renato Rosaldo, whose work on emotions we mentioned in Chapter 1, studied the emotional lives of the Ingat of the Philippines, who have a history of headhunting. The motivation, I said that way too, there's a lot of positivity behind that. Okay, the motivation for headhunting she describes comes from liget, liget, a concept that overlaps but with is distinct from our concept of anger. Western understandings of anger assume that underlying anger causes hostility, but Rosaldo cautions that Ingat do not recognize that anger or liget underlies hostility and violence, much less headhunting. According to Ingat, passion and a heavy heart, not anger, motivate headhunting. They also do not recognize anger as the cause of other social tensions and conflicts. So do they really understand anger as we do? Rosaldo concluded that they do not, writing important ways their feelings and the ways their feelings work must differ from our own. Such studies suggest that not only do different cultures lead people to understand themselves differently from us, but when they experience emotional disturbances and even mental illnesses, they behave and react differently as well. Culture and mental illness. Accepting the existence of cross-cultural differences in how people think about even the most basic psychological and emotional processes and conditions has an important consequence. We have to approach mental illness in a culturally relative way. Psychological abnormality is always defined culturally because what is considered abnormal is based on socially accepted norms. Not all societies define the same conditions as psychologically abnormal, nor do they necessarily share the same mental illness. A well-known example of so-called culture-bound syndrome, a mental illness unique to a culture, is Koro, the condition unique to Chinese and Southeast Asian cultures in which an individual believes his external genitalia, or in a female, nipples are shrinking and even disappearing. What counts as a mental illness can also change in a society. Homosexuality is one such example, although today few people view it as an illness. Until 1974, American psychiatrists classified homosexuality as a mental disorder, and the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service used the classification of homosexuality as abnormal as a reason for excluding immigrants until 1990. The ability to define any condition or behavior as a psychiatric disturbance reflects great social power and can have serious consequences for the course of an individual's life and for his or her experience of self. As we see an anthropologist as problem solver, Kim Hopper, Homelessness and the Mentally Ill in New York City, which is a book title, anthropologists have paid close attention to the relationship between psychiatry and social power because different societies define mental illness differently based on specific understandings of individual psychology. Their treatment can differ too. For example, on the Indonesian island of Bali, persons are not conceived of as isolated or indivisible as we conceive of them in the West. Spirits and deceased ancestors commonly reside in individuals. Madness, Buddha, can be caused by inherent factors, congenital influences, an ancestral or divine curse, or the blessings of gods. Connor, 1982. The task of the village-level healer, called the Balian, is to identify the specific causes of madness, which are usually related to some kind of social disruption or family conflict. The Balian then resolves the conflict or disharmony in the family or neighborhood. Western psychiatry's approach, which often involves isolating the individual through institutionalization or providing pharmaceuticals, would clearly be inappropriate if not socially disruptive in these circumstances. Nevertheless, as documented in Ethan Waters' book, Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche, Western psychological terms, notions, and illnesses are globalizing rapidly in recent years. For example, mental illness such as depression, anorexia, and post-traumatic stress disorder seem to now exist in places that have never had them before, such as Hong Kong, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania. Waters suggests that much of this is taking place because of the increasingly global flows of Western media and psychiatric practices, as well as the expansion of pharmaceutical companies into new markets throughout the globe. Waters argues that such practices, which are usually based on an assumption of hyper-individualism, destabilize indigenous nations and ways of treating mental illness in social context. We can bring these insights about psychological processes and mental illness beliefs even further with a biocultural approach that combines cultural and biological insights. Rebecca Slayman has conducted research on candomblé, a spirit possession religion in Brazil. Seligman asked a simple question: why do certain people become spirit mediums and others do not? Biomedicine explains mediumship as a psychological disturbance with a biological basis, but fails to explain how and why such a disturbance might express itself specifically through mediumship. The cultural approach argues that oppressed and marginalized individuals gravitate towards mediumship, but it fails to explain why not all dispossessed people become mediums. Seligman found that there is no single pathway to mediumship, but the interaction of biological, psychological, and cultural factors plays a crucial role. Among these are a psychological ability to achieve disassociation, trance states, conditions of poverty and oppression that cause emotional distress, which is often experienced through bodily pain, and a cultural outlet and a social role that rewards people who exhibit the qualities of mediumship. Seligman concludes that without this holistic perspective on a medium's experience, we cannot appreciate the complexity of how people become mediums. Such biocultural approaches in psychological anthropology open up new possibilities of collaboration between the natural and social sciences. And as we will see in the next section, other natural and social scientific collaborations aimed at increasing understanding of the relationship between individuals, biology, and culture focus on understanding the role of evolution in shaping individual behavior and cognition. What role does evolution play in human lives? The phenomenon of evolution, that life forms make adaptive changes over generations, is widely believed to play a central role in shaping our human nature as individuals, and it has also played a key role in anthropological study. This section explains the basics of evolution and then explores the relationship between evolution and culture. Understanding evolution among human populations. When Charles Darwin first published his revolutionary book on the origin of species in 1859, he argued that the visible characteristics of an organism, what has come to be known as a phenotype, were shaped over time through an evolutionary mechanism called natural selection. Behind natural selection was Darwin's observation that life existed under complex changing conditions and that those individuals having inherited traits best suited to a particular environment will survive and reproduce. For example, if the wild seeds available in one particular island are generally very large, birds with larger beaks will be better fed because their beaks are better suited to get nutrients from the seeds than birds with smaller beaks. Consequently, the larger beaked birds normally have more offspring that survive into adulthood because they will inherit larger beaks from their parents. Conversely, these larger beaked birds will be at a disadvantage on other islands where smaller seeds are more plentiful. Darwin observed this very pattern among several species of finches on the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s. According to Darwin's theory, we would expect the environment, in this case the size of the seeds, to select or favor the most appropriate beaks for the given localities. Natural selection shapes all species, including our own. Once Homo sapiens became anatomically modern about 100,000 years ago, our species and those of the closest cousins, especially the Neanderthals, were capable of symbolic thought. This enhanced cognition had several advantages, including the making of better and more sophisticated tools, organizing social groups for hunting and building and for defense against animals or even hostile humans. Those groups with more sophisticated strategies for organizing themselves were more likely to survive and reproduce than neighboring groups with less developed cognition. Natural selection is one of 4 evolutionary mechanisms that shape the type of physical characteristics of any population of animals or humans. The second evolutionary mechanism is that of mutation. Mutations are slight, unpredictable variations in genetic code that occur when 2 organisms reproduce. Mutations may be passed along to offspring and become widespread, or they may simply disappear from the population. Mutations may have no effect on the organism's ability to survive, or they may result in genetic changes that could help or hinder an individual. Some mutations cause genetic disorders and susceptibility to illness. Others may benefit an organism by making it more resistant to certain diseases or infection. Mutations may also affect the phenotype or observable traits of an individual, such as the shape of the nose or length of the fingers, among many traits. The third and fourth evolutionary mechanism neither add to the variation in a population nor cause particular phenotypes to disappear. What they do is move existing traits around within populations. Gene flow is the movement of genes through interbreeding or intermarriage among humans from distinct populations. For example, when hundreds of thousands of African slaves were brought to North America, many slave owners of European heritage had children with Africans, which changed the distribution of genes within the North American population. One result was that the physical characteristics of phenotype of the slave population, including skin color, gradually blended with those of white North Americans. Gene flow caused the 2 widely separated populations, the Africans in North America and those living in Africa, to diverge in certain traits, which is why many African Americans have lighter complexions than African peoples. Genetic drift. The last of the 4 evolutionary mechanisms is only important when population size are small and possibly isolated geographically. It consists of random sampling effects, not natural selection, that brings changes to the distribution of traits within a population. Today, this mechanism is most noticeable in small islands in the Pacific or among small isolated communities in which the arrival of a small group of immigrants with a peculiar characteristic has a significant but random effect on the genetic variations found in the population. For example, if a single male immigrant to a small, isolated population brings a rare genetic trait to the island's population, this trait may be distributed among descendants of the individual after several generations. After a few hundred years, it could be present in nearly all of the island's population. Gene flow and genetic drift work on human populations in opposite ways. Groups that move further apart and have less interaction experience genetic drift as these two groups gradually start to differ from one another. At the same time, when groups interact and share genes, the mechanism of gene flow neutralizes any differences that might exist with two populations by disrupting genes over a number of generations within the interacting populations. Natural selection also affects gene distribution. We can see the most clearly in the distribution of skin tone across human populations. All Homo sapiens emerged from Central Africa, but as they moved out of Africa into Europe and Asia, natural selection favored melanin and darker skin tones in more tropical areas with more direct sunlight. Simultaneously, groups that moved towards the Arctic benefited by pale skin and less melanin. There were adaptive advantages for individuals with less skin pigment in northern, colder climates, and similar advantages for individuals with more pigmentation in more equatorial regions and more direct sun. The traditional distribution of skin tone before the age of discovery around 1500 shows that groups near the equator tend to have darker skin colors, whether in Africa, Asia, New Guinea, or the Americas. Simultaneously, groups living in far north regions in Europe, Asia, and Americas have less pigment and lighter skin tone, irrespective of where their ancestors may have come from. Such patterns demonstrate natural selection at work by showing that skin color is most strongly shaped by available sunlight more than by ancestry. Racism and early evolutionary models in anthropology. During the late 19th century, when racism permeated both the public and the intellectual climate in Europe and North America, the theory of evolution appeared to offer an objective way of classifying the world's diverse peoples. See also Chapter 11. Many anthropologists of this period saw their discipline as a branch of natural history, like zoologists and botanists. Many saw their goal as finding a suitable way to classify human cultures as well as their religions, their kinship system, their political forms, and the material objects in their daily lives. Many assumed that these other domains, like region, kinship, politics, and material culture, would all map onto observable physical traits like skin color, hair, texture, etc., that these same researchers used to classify human biological groupings. Not surprisingly, these 19th century classifications made by white Europeans were racial scales, putting blacks and other non-white groups on the bottom and whites on the top. Such models were used to justify colonial conquest of people of color around the world. To distance itself from these ideas, mainstream anthropology avoided evolutionary explanations of human behavior for a long time. In order to understand how anthropologists can contribute to our understanding of the role of evolution in human lives, we need to first understand why that history of avoidance was justified and consider how biocultural perspectives can help us understand the role of evolution in human lives. Franz Boas and anti-evolutionism. Swimming against the current of racial thought during these early years of anthropology was Franz Boas, who harshly criticized attempts to equate evolution with racial theories. are Melagos and Goodman, 1998. For example, he rejected the idea that there are groups of people belonging to stable and unchanging races, and he used biological data to prove that human populations in fact change. He also rejected the idea that there is an average phenotype within any of the groups that biologists and earlier anthropologists had identified as racial groups, arguing rather that there is greater variability within any group than between groups. He strongly resisted the linkage between race and individual character. For instance, Boas challenged racial science's use of the cephalic index, a ratio derived from the maximum length of a skull to its maximum width, which many researchers had used trying to prove that the so-called superior racial groups had bigger brains. Boas in 1912 measured the brain cavities of European immigrants to America and their children, and discovered that the cavities of individuals born in America were larger than those of individuals born in Europe because of improvements in diet and health in their adopted country. Boas' insight was to use biological data to show how nurture, cultural factors, and in this case, the food people consume, can influence the shape of nature, that is physiology and anatomy. Ultimately, Boas' interracial stand was not an argument that humans and their cultures were not shaped by their physical and social environments, but rather than an attack on the process of classifying different people and cultures among some hierarchical scale based on skin color and hair texture. Boas' model came to be understood as anti-evolutionary. Nevertheless, anti-evolutionism was one of the most influential forces in anthropology, and at least partially explains why most social and cultural anthropologists have emphasized culture's independence from biology, moving beyond purely biological notions of evolution. And I think that's a good place to stop. We're at about an hour on GarageBand, so we will be back with the next episode, moving beyond purely biological notions of evolution. See you next time.